everyone, it's Sarah. Today I'm going to talk about a book that I recently read, and that is Gone with the Wind by Margaret Mitchell. Now, this book is super long. I went back and forth from reading this lovely paperback version that I borrowed from my mother and listening to the audiobook. This is one of my mom's favorite books and favorite movies, so I wanted to read it for that reason. But also, I'm doing the Popsugar 2015 reading challenge, where you have to read 50 books with different qualifications, and one of them was to read a book set in your hometown. Now, I'm from the Atlanta area. Technically, I'm from the northern suburbs of Atlanta, Marietta, Kennesaw kind of area, if you're familiar. But that's basically Atlanta. So Gone with the Wind is pretty much set in Atlanta for the most part. The Battle of Kennesaw Mountain is actually mentioned, and I live like right next to that mountain. So I'd say it's my hometown. In case you've been living under a rock, Gone with the Wind is this classic, epic story about the South during the Civil War. It's kind of her epic love/war saga. I really enjoyed the experience of reading this book and listening to this book. It was like when I read Les Miserables by Victor Hugo, in that I was so immersed in the world of the book. It was also cool to read a book about Atlanta with so many references to things that I see all the time. Even though this is Civil War era Atlanta and not modern day Atlanta, it was still pretty cool to read about places that I see every day. It was definitely an interesting book for me to read. Being from Atlanta, from the South, I feel like everyone who lives in the South, who is kind of more the liberal, progressive, feminist type person that I consider myself to be, I feel like we all have kind of a love-hate relationship with the South, and it's very interesting to think about our history with the Civil War and slavery and all of that. On the one hand, Georgia and the South is a very beautiful place to live. There's lots of beautiful landscapes and mountains and beautiful, fields and lots of trees, and it's very beautiful here. But on the other hand, you have, just a history of prejudice and bigotry and all of that. So it just kind of makes for an interesting landscape, I think. And this was definitely something that I was thinking about as I was reading this novel. One of the most interesting things to me about this novel is witnessing the collapse of an entire civilization. Because the South, before the Civil War, it was almost like they were trying to go back to some feudalism kind of time with, you had the plantation owners and the slaves. It was very similar to kind of royals and peasants, that sort of thing. So to me, not only was it the collapse of an entire way of life, what happens when you essentially force a group of people who are not progressive at all to make social progress. And what's also interesting is Scarlett O'Hara, at the beginning of the novel, she's kind of this naive, teenager who has all of these dreams about what a young lady is supposed to be and how her life is going to be, and all of these ideas based on the culture around her. And as this society kind of collapses, she also, is stripped down to something else, and her way of life collapses as well. Where by the end of the novel, she's had to basically break all of the rules that were given to her by society. Now, obviously, there are some, obvious problematic things about reading this book in 2015. reading it from a modern perspective, there were a lot of things that made me uncomfortable. But I think it's also good for people to read because it does show the process of kind of othering and making people less than. In this case, it was essentially everyone who's not a white upper class male. Obviously, I don't think you can call this a feminist novel. It did have a lot of strong female characters that were doing things that could definitely be considered, feminist, especially for the time period that it was written. But I wouldn't call it a feminist novel because the only strong female characters really in the book were white female characters. And there were, some problematic things like the scene where Rhett Butler essentially forces Scarlett O'Hara to have sex with him, and she ends up kind of enjoying it. So it was really the sort of, she said no, but she meant yes kind of mentality. So obviously, you can't really call it a feminist novel, I don't think. But you do have to think about the time period that Margaret Mitchell was writing this in, and you also have to think about her background as a white female in the South. But I think it's good to be aware of these things, obviously, but you also can't just discount all of the classics that are problematic, because then you probably wouldn't have any classics, really, let's be honest. But I think one of the cool things is I feel like we evolve as a society, and I think that reading classics like this one, it's almost like a little snapshot of where we once were. But from a strictly writing standpoint, the prose in this book is really beautiful and well done. I mean, there is a reason why it did win the Pulitzer Prize, and it is considered an American classic. Scarlett O'Hara was definitely not a likable character, I would say, but she was interesting to read about. Actually, if we're being honest, with the exception of Melanie, I don't really think any of these people in the book are, great people. But for me, I don't need a character to be completely likable or relatable to enjoy a story. And Rhett Butler is another really interesting character. I wouldn't say he's a good person at all, but he is kind of likable. One thing about this book was I felt like it was interesting the whole way through. I didn't really think there was a lot of downtime, which is unusual for a book of this length. I was really engaged the whole way through. But overall, I am really glad that I read this. It was a really good experience, and it was very thought-provoking. It just made me think a lot about, our history as a country and in the South and in Georgia specifically. So yeah, I know there are like a million other things that I have forgotten that I wanted to say about this book, but I am ultimately glad that I read it. Have any of you guys read this book? What did you think about it? Did you like it? Hate it? Let me know. Alright, that's all I have on Gone with the Wind. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel if you want to see more videos about writing or about books. And I will see you guys next time. Thanks for watching.